Coming to you from the world of AV programming and control with James King. I'm Steve Greenblatt, and this is Ask the Programmer. Hey, James, I'm glad we're back for another session.
Oh, always great to be back, Steve, and look forward to having this discussion with you.
As do I. And you and I were having a conversation, and you were talking about how you were shuffling between different priorities and writing code and coming back and it kind of brought up the idea of how do programmers balance working on different projects. So I'll let you give a little bit of background as to your experience, and I'm sure that we can go from there. And I have some insight that I can share from my experience as well.
Yeah, so the situation you were referencing is I'm working on a pet project at work. It's one of those when I have time work on here and there. It's not a control system per se, but I'm actually building a my own management system where I'll track inventory and have some other bells and whistles into it. And as I mentioned, it's a pet project, so it's one of those that side burn, like you work on it here and there. And I was working on it the other day, and I'm like, I don't even remember where I left off. I had to like revisit my code to see which file had this function in it and change some things around. So it took me like almost 15 minutes of my time just reviewing my code and the structure I was doing before I even started to write any new code. And it was then brought up to, well, I'm sure like third house programmers and even AV programmers are a lot of projects. How do you balance all of them?
I definitely can relate to that. And I think that's a really good point, because it's one of the things that I found is that programmers need a lot of concentration in what they're doing. And to that point, their ability to kind of think through, get in the zone, if you will, and think through where they are, where they're going, and how their code is going to connect down the road is pretty critical. And you know, part of the nature of AV is that the programs and the systems are evolving. So what you work on now, you may have to come back and change. And we've talked about going back to old code before, but when you're developing, sometimes you need to almost like put a marker in your code. One of the things that I used to do is just keep a document open and just write down notes so that I can give myself a little bit of a roadmap, or like leave some breadcrumbs, if you will, so that I can kind of get myself and see what I've done, and that should help me to understand where I'm going. And I would even put some questions in there or some things that I knew I had to do. And I also am always big in saving backups. So I used to save lots of revisions, and most of those revisions, quite honestly, were pre-releases. So they never actually got implemented, but they were partial programs. So that's my experience. But how did you end up getting your project on track?
So besides reviewing my code for the first 15 minutes, one thing I started doing, this was a method I took from the Raspberry Pi project I worked on at home, because again, that was due at my own leisure, was I created a note file on my phone, or which again with my Mac, I can switch between my phone and my computer, where I just start writing down like, okay, I need to do this. All right, here's a bug here. And almost like you were saying in your code, but mine's in a file instead of in the code, pointing out what still needs to be done and what might be an issue and what isn't an issue. And that seems to help me keep track. It's now just staying on top of that file.
Yeah, I actually used to take those comments and put them into a document too. So I think we're kind of on the same page with that. Do you do anything with regard to version control and tracking, or how do you save your backups?
So I'm a little bad at that, but I do save backups. Um, but more not like a version control, but I date my backups. So I'll do a backup. Like if I do it today, it'll be today's date. And then say I do another one next week or so, it'll be that date. So I have those whole directories backed up with different dates on them. So I know I can go back, and not a true version, I would say. I got to get better at doing that.
Yeah, I think we've talked about that a little bit before, but that could be a real killer. And also, I think the value of backups really come into play when you're writing code and something crashes in the middle, and you haven't done a save, or you don't have something to fall back to, or you get a corrupt file. So for anybody out there listening, please take that time and save yourself the pain that many of us have gone through. And I'm sure if you've experienced it, you're already coming up with some type of a system.
Oh yeah, I remember I worked back when I was a student worker. I was working on a system. It was a class project, and we actually implemented it at work. And I forgot to set up a backup on the database and wiped the machine that the database was on. So I had to re-enter all the data again. Luckily, like I say, it was a test system. It was something I was building, but I learned quickly back up your database. Um, I had a teacher back in when I was doing networking class who was pretty good at making sure students learn how to back up in real world situations. The class was we had to learn to program routers. So there was a rack in the back of the room. Every student had their own router, and we're going through the class and programming the router. And he just mosey on around the class like a teacher normally does, checking on things. He goes to the back rack and pulls the power to the UPS. And he's like, "All right, you got 1 minute to save your work." And that you never seen somebody move so quickly to get it onto the router. That was pretty quick.
Absolutely. There's nothing better than trial by fire. And honestly, that's the type of experience or environment that we can be in AV programming. In that AV programming, a lot of times you're on a job site, and that job site is under construction, where you might have temporary power, or you might have extension cords running across the floor that somebody could trip over, or whatever other types of pitfalls that naturally occur on a job site where a programmer probably doesn't belong.
Yeah, that's one thing I like about our environment where, yeah, we'll get on real job sites like buildings being built, but I got in the habit of I'll push equipment in our environment, like in my office. So it's now to the point where all the tech has to do, even if it's me in the room, is install and plug and turn on. Then there's like little to nothing the techs need to do because everything else is already loaded, ready to go.
That's ideal if you and you have the privilege of being able to control your environment a little bit, being that
Yeah.
you guys do in-house integration. So that's certainly a value there. um the aside from what we were saying, switching between doing a program or putting it down and coming back some time ago, um, how difficult do you find it to have to be kind of manage different projects simultaneously?
Um, I find myself I big picture management, I can probably handle it pretty well. But when you get into like making sure the nuts and bolts, those you really gotta focus and really get down, making sure you are paying attention to all the details. Because as we mentioned, the small details, if they're not taken care of, they blow up in your face in the big time. So it's really making sure you have the naming convention correctly and make sure you have all your documentation. So you know when you go into a room what that room is doing, especially in a college environment or even a corporate environment, which I'm sure you find yourself into, is not every room doing the same thing. So we could have 14 rooms being built in a class as in a building as standard classrooms. Easy, but we may have that one room that's a flex space. But if I push a classroom code to that, it ain't gonna work.
Absolutely. Um, the 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 other thing that comes to mind for me is just being able to uh, keep tabs on where things stand with regard to I'm at this stage in this project and this stage in another project. A lot of times the need to troubleshoot, I would imagine when you're working in similar, especially in similar systems, becomes that much more difficult because you may have fixed something in one room and realize that that same issue needs to be resolved in another room. Uh, so that begs to question how how do you manage like punch lists? Do you have like a central place to document everything when it comes to
Yeah,
stuff
we
like that?
do. We have a ticket system that we'll use. I'll use it heavily for documenting that stuff. Or I'll create if we're doing like a building, I'll create a spreadsheet share with the text, and we just use that as a punch list that note everything that needs to be done and comments, and then we go back and review that. Um, but that actually brings into a question of mine with revisiting code when you're managing projects is how do you, as in your field, manage when you say you do a function and then maybe you step away from that project and you come back to it even 3 weeks later, but you learn a better way of doing that function. How do you go back and make sure you apply that to what you already written without delaying yourself?
So sometimes you can do that and sometimes you can't. And the best way to do it is write modular code so that you are creating either a library or an include file or a module that you can update and then bring that in compile time so that your change gets adopted. But you have to be very careful because depending on the stage of a project, it may not be the risk may not be worth the reward to start to change things if you're getting close to completion, because anytime, as we've discussed before, you make a change, you have to make sure that you didn't impact something else. So it does get a little tricky, and but that's probably the best way of doing it is to write modular code.
That's a good advice right there.
Well, I think that's probably a good place for us to wrap this one. But I know that you and I have been gaining a lot of insight from listeners, and we've been really enjoying this project together. One of the things that we look forward to is getting more comments and more input and feedback, and helping to drive the conversation here. So please reach out to us and let us know what you think, and let's keep this conversation going, because just to remind everyone that this is really built to be able to create community and bridge the gap between programmers of all walks of life. And that's one of the reasons why I think the conversations that we have are so valuable, because we do come from very different backgrounds. Why don't you, if you have any closing thoughts, and please share how everyone can reach out to you.
I think closing wise, you hit it pretty well. We love to hear from our listeners. That's where we grow and we all learn from each other. So definitely provide us feedback and help us grow this community. You can find me on Twitter at AV_James King, LinkedIn, James King on there. I also write for the Higher Ed Digital Magazine. I write the column IT and AV, and you can also find me on the weekly podcast of the AV Life.
And for me, you can find me on social media at Steve Greenblatt, and you can also see some of my writings on AV Network, and also host a State of Control on avnation.tv. So please check that out as well. And this podcast is available on all sorts of platforms. So we have it on Apple and Google, as well as on YouTube. Comments, questions, ratings, reviews are welcome in all platforms. That's a good place for us to wrap. And this has been Ask the Programmer.